Get ready for a comparison that will pit two sports cars from different generations against each other. We will dissect lap times, engineering, and the story of how both these cars came to life. The hybridized performance vehicle is a formula you're going to continue to hear about probably for the next 2 decades. Many people are phobic of this technology in sports cars because of the added weight and complication. But we're here to explain the benefits and some of the negatives of that in this video. It's a modern way for manufacturers to keep the internal combustion engine around by using an electric motor to meet some of these very stringent regulatory requirements in fuel economy and, of course, emission standards. Think of the electric motor as a modern way of supercharging or turbocharging these cars. It adds the low-end torque to get you off the line or be in EV mode, something that electric cars do much better than internal combustion counterparts with traditional transmissions. It's that torque fill to smooth out gear changes, and it's also there to add an enormous amount of power and give you all-wheel drive capability. We're going to look at 2 cars, specifically one of the original cars that tried to do this. The Acura NSX, which ended production with this Type S behind us in 2022. In the modern iteration of it, the Chevrolet Corvette E-Ray. Now, both of these cars have very unique ways of adding hybridization and different ways of how they wanted to achieve this performance. We're going to take both cars to Autobahn Country Club and set lap times with Britt, our professional driver. We're going to compare those lap times and, more importantly, what the cars actually feel like.
Hi, my name is Jonathon Rivers, and for the second generation Acura NSX, I was an assistant program manager on the Ohio R&D development team. Now, what exactly does an assistant program manager do? Well, they work amongst a team of engineers, and they're responsible for the entire vehicle development schedule, budgeting, and team resources. I was also able to leverage the fact that I can speak Japanese, so working with the Japanese engineers, the development team there as well. You know, I got a chance to meet Uehara-san, the original global development leader for the first gen NSX, and work hand in hand with Wada-san, Tsukamoto-san, and Watanabe-san, all the key powertrain engineers for the second generation NSX. So I'll always finally look back on that experience. So let's talk about the actual development of the second generation NSX. Many of you may not know, but it started development in Japan, and there was even talks that it may be built in Japan. But unfortunately, outside of all of our control, there was a major earthquake in 2011. It had massive impact and did major damage not only to our R&D facilities, but to some of our factories as well. It was at that point that the company had to make a very hard decision to figure out how to finish the development of this car. And well, luckily we had a very capable R&D center in Ohio that, well, raised their hand and said, we'll take this project all the way to the finish line. So that was a key point in transitioning not only the development scope of the project, but ultimately what type of car it would become.
やっぱりそのファーストジェネレーションの車でできなかったことをどうやって解決しようかと思っていた時に、その10年間の間に技術ってどんどん進んでるわけですよね。でそれがやっぱり、セカンドジェネレーションの NSX と合体するといいますかね。合体した時に新しい世界が見えるんじゃないのかなということで 企画はしたわけなんですよね。で先ほども確かにアメリカで開発になったんで、正直言うと自分たちはちょっと残念なところもあったんですけども、でも同じコンセプトで同じ考えで開発をすればどこで作っても同じになるんじゃないかなと思いますね。ですから彼らもと僕らはワンチームで開発できたのかなというふうに思いますけども。
私も今までファーストジェネレーションの NSX は、ある意味コンベンショナルな構成でハードウェアの構成でどこまで今までの車の作り方と違う、トラディショナルなヨーロッパスポーツとかとは違うホンダオリジナルの、パフォーマンスというのが出せるのがチャレンジしたんだと思うんですよね。で、だんだん次のネクストジェネレーションになるとやっぱり今までみたいな、エンジン普通にエンジン仮にV8、V10、ではない、NSX を考えるときにはやっぱりコンパクトなベーシックスエンジンとモーターで作られる新しいパフォーマンスというのが、次の、新しい価値を生み出すそのハードウェアになりうる、そこにチャレンジしたのが、セカンドジェネレーションの NSX だと思うんですよね。だからさらに時代はもう変わっていくので、次は多分本当にバッテリー EV の世界でどこまで出せるかというところになっていくので、パワーユニットはそうやっても時代進化でそういうなっていくのは必然というか、逆に言うとそこにチャレンジしていくのがべきだと思いますよね。あとはさっき今和田の方も言いましたけど、やっぱりそこで差が出てくる。今までホンダの強みはエンジンの、テクニカルなすごく強みがあって、それが今度はモーターっていうものが変わってくると、その差異がだんだんつきづらくなってくるけど、シャシの方は、車は動くものだから、タイヤがついている以上はそのサスペンション、シャシ性能、全体のトータルダイナミクスみたいなところっていうのは各作るメーカーのキャラクターっていいますかね、狙うところっていうのがすごく反映されてくるもんだと思うんですよね。だからそういう意味ですごくそれぞれのカーメーカーの特徴が出てくる時代になってくるんじゃないかなとは思いますね。
So some may wonder why the NSX has come and gone throughout time here. And, I think the easiest way to address it is that, for us, the NSX, its idea is it really is kind of this moonshot exercise for the company to flex our engineering prowess to show what we can do. And when you look at other brands, things like the 911 and the Corvette, well, those are mainstay products that stay with those brands throughout time. The NSX is totally different. We really try to flex our muscles and come up with something unique at that time. And I think that was the case for the first generation NSX, definitely the case for the second generation NSX. So you can imagine when it's time to develop a third generation NSX, it'll be when the company is truly trying to innovate and create something new and unique in the marketplace. At our company, Honda and Acura, we're filled with enthusiasts. So we love to see other vehicles, other brands like the Corvette, take the template that the second generation NSX created with this electrified 3-motor hybrid system. Now, obviously they're using their own platform and taking their own spin to this approach, but it's great to see the industry grow and move forward with this electrified future.
Now here's where the story gets a bit more interesting. Chevy knew they had to evolve the Corvette for the 8th generation by moving it to mid-engine, bringing it up market, higher quality. It's a completely different approach. Honda, on the other hand, has been struggling with trying to get a second generation NSX out for the better half of 2 decades. The last car was designed in the 80s and 90s. Now they did build a front engine supercar with a V10 that was completely done, ready to go in production, and then they killed it off. So the public opinion, the fans of NSX have been waiting for a long time for a sequel. And it really puts your back against the wall. The expectations are sky high that they do this right. And as Jonathon said, as development started in Japan, things started to fall apart already. And when it came to the United States, there were a lot of questions. The other part of the NSX story is that they had to develop a car in a record amount of time. Once this project was greenlight, essentially had 3 years to get everything done. and 5 years before the car needed to go into production. And we're talking about building a brand new engine from the ground up, brand new gearbox that they've never done before, a hybrid system they've never done before, a brand new aluminum chassis, setting up a factory in the United States. All this technical know-how had to be thrown at it in such a short period of time. And I think one of the most confusing parts of this is very early on, it was decided that this car would not go past one generation. Of course, there was going to be some mid-cycle updates, but it was dead after it reached the end. And I think that's where some of these decisions were made to throw the kitchen sink at this car. A lot of things were put into it in terms of technology because they knew they had one shot at it. And we're going to talk about that later in this video of whether that was a good idea or not. It doesn't translate well. The big thing is when this car was completed, the takeaway was they were trying to do a lot of what made the first generation NSX great in terms of usability, interior, visibility, comfort. And it checked all those boxes. When you drive the latest generation NSX, it is super comfortable. You drive it every single day and you don't even notice it's a supercar. With the hybridization, which is now commonplace on a lot of regular cars, you can drive and the engine just turns off. You can roll in EV mode. You can start stop without knowing the car's even on or off. It's all these things that make it a much more calm experience, yet you have supercar performance underneath of you. So that's the argument. The Type S was pushing 200 grand, right? Do you want a car to be super quiet and comfortable all the time, or do you want it to be a supercar? And I think that's where some of the confusion lied. And even those initial complaints from media and fans of the previous car thought that they didn't take the car to the next level in terms of emotion. And when we were in Japan doing a documentary on the first generation NSX, we got to ask them about how they felt about that.
初代 NSX も最初は必ずしもポジティブに受け入れられたわけではないですよね。最初の2年ぐらいはなんだろうな、まあこんな車は甘っちょろいというか、まあ、乗りやすいという。でもだんだんそれは時代とともにそれが世の中のスタンダードに、まあ、世の中というかスポーツカーのスタンダードになりつつあるっていうところは、まあ後で認められてきてそういう熱狂的なファンも登場してきているということだから、まあ、新しいことにチャレンジすると最初そこに対してのそのまあ拒絶反応じゃないですけど、まあ、そういう反応が出るけどだんだんその、まあ、それが進化して浸透していけばそれは逆に言うと新しいチャレンジした NSX というのが認められてくるんじゃないのっていうふうには思いますよね。だからまあそこの考え、まあ、全部踏襲しながらその延長線上に行くんじゃなくてやっぱそこは一回変えるっていうアプローチが NSX に、まあ、課せられた、まあ、なんとかな課題というだと思いますけどね。だからそのうち、まあ、認められてくると僕は信じてるし別にそれがアメリカ開発だからといって、まあ、それは最初のうちはこうやっぱりね考え方の違いだとかっていうのもありますけど、まあ、そこはだんだん、まあ、我々も、まあ、その当時和田も何人も行って向こうとすり合わせたりしながら車として完成させてきているので、まあ、そこの、まあ、蓄積っていうのはねきっとあるしアメリカだからこうなったというのはないと思います。
The development story behind the E-Ray is far less dramatic than that of the NSX. And before we talk about that, of course, both of the vehicles' finer technical details when we put them up in the air, I want to get this out of the way. One of the beautiful things about the Corvette is Chevrolet has essentially democratized access to the sports car through sheer production capacity. They build nearly 200 Corvettes every single day, with over 40,000 C8s being built every single year. Essentially, they've amortized the cost over all of their customers, thus driving down the MSRP and making these things accessible. They also have an incredible wealth of knowledge behind their team. Much like something like the Porsche 911, they've been building this thing for over 70 years. There are 8 generations of Corvette, and many of the team members on C8 worked on C5, C6, C7, and now, of course, this car. When we talk about the development story, it's important to think about timetable. This car was built or started development in 2015, over 9 years ago at this point. And before I get too much into that, it's important to bring up the fact that we did a real E-Ray video where you get to hear directly from Keith, Trevor, and Sarab, the controls engineer. Keith, of course, helped us with this video as well. He was there at the track supporting the car. The development of this car was changing all the way up to 2017, where some of the parameters and basic ideas for the product were also changing. However, the first rolling chassis came out in 2016. The E-Ray from the beginning was always going to be, however, that do-everything Swiss Army knife Corvette. Much like the original NSX, this was supposed to be that everyday supercar that broadened the Corvette's appeal. You could drive this in snow, you could drive this year-round, it would be a super GT, a long-distance cruiser, and of course, very, very capable on the track. And when it comes to hybridization, in the case of the Corvette, hybridization was not done for fuel economy, or emissions, or the environment. It was done to make this a more capable sports car. Because this car did not have to deal with the packaging constraints of a traditional mechanical all-wheel drive system where they had to send a drive shaft to the front, they could get away with maintaining better chassis rigidity and a faster acting all-wheel drive setup. That's the benefit of this electric motor. So with that said, let's head in the shop and put this car up on the lift. In the shop with the Corvette E-Ray, just like the NSX, this is a performance hybrid. And on paper, if you're looking at it from a macro perspective, they are very similar. They're both mid-engine, they're both double wishbone, they both have MR dampers and brake-by-wire.
Aluminum chassis, like all, yeah.
Yeah, and they're manufactured, as I talked about earlier, in a very similar but different fashion, right? They use composite and aluminum structures, but the way they approach how the E-motors, or in this case, single E-motor, affects performance and the philosophy behind a lot of the tuning decisions is very unique. Let's talk about what the E-Ray is. This is on the wide body found on the Z06, which means it's 3.6 inches wider than the standard Stingray, which means more cooling. And of course, the aero properties of this are very similar to the Z06. They make some specific changes, but if you have the track or performance packages for the E-Ray, which is just aero and the summer tires, it makes a little less than 400 pounds of total downforce. If you don't like the street version we have, which doesn't have a track alignment and is on all seasons, is basically aero neutral, which means no lift. When it comes to the actual body structure, the front of this car, the front subframe gets changed primarily to fit the E-motor. The shock towers get raised. They have to add a strut tower brace, which you can't see, to add back some of that rigidity and some of the compromises they made in that regards. The E-motor is very, very small. It makes 160 horsepower, a little over 120 foot-pounds of torque or thereabouts. It weighs 80 pounds. There is a 1.9 kilowatt hour LG Chem pouch style battery pack that sits in the trans tunnel, or what is effectively the center console area. It has nearly 50% coverage for cooling, so you don't run into a cooling issue. One thing which I will talk about in a little bit is how the battery retains charge to put power back to the front of this vehicle. The E-motor in this car is added both as a propulsion device and as a stability device. The reason they went with the hybrid setup, as I talked about earlier, has nothing to do with the environment, it has everything to do with performance. By adding a front electric motor, they did not have to add the complexity of a mechanical drivetrain through the center of this vehicle with a differential and essentially a drive shaft. This makes it easier to package. Effectively, the C8, the E-Ray portion of this, and let's say potential other future variants of this are designed around that electrification of the front axle. It is double wishbone front and rear, just like the NSX. You get full alignment capability. In fact, unlike the NSX, they actually give you track alignment and street alignment. The track alignment has a lot of camber. It's over 2.7 degrees of negative camber. Street alignment, obviously, much, much less than that. You get two different tire choices for this car, and they are ultra wide. Same tire width as the Z06. In fact, basically the same wheel options. 275 front, 345 rear. This street car has an all-season. You can also get a summer tire. They are absolutely massive. This has GM's carbon ceramic brakes, which come as standard. They are ultra capable, and just like in the NSX, they are ultra expensive to replace. The E-Ray only comes that way. The discs in the front are over $4,000 each. The discs in the rear are over $4,000 each. The brake pads are $1,000 in the front, $1,000 in the back. These are the identical carbon ceramics found on the Z07 packaged Z06. Wheel options, you can either get these forged wheels, and unlike the NSX, you can get carbon wheels, which this street car does not have, but the track variant we drove did. They save 41 pounds in there by Carbon Revolutions. They actually changed the wheel studs for the carbon fiber wheels. So if you have a car that has the carbon fiber wheels, you can put back on the forged wheels, but you cannot do the other thing. Now, when it comes to the rear of this car, standard, obviously different programming for the E-diff in the back, which is GM's famous E-diff with all the PTM modes, but it's the LT2. They add an auxiliary pump, so you can basically deal with the electrification of this so it can start up on a roll. It is a 6.2 liter dry sump V8. It sounds like a V8, it makes V8 noises. The E-Ray's e-motor philosophy is more about how do I make the most performance capable all-wheel drive system. So corner entry, this car is effectively rear-wheel drive. Here's the diagram. Go into the corner, all the power is in the back, it's working with the differential. Mid-corner, you're still using the power in the rear to yaw it out so it doesn't understeer. And then as you leave the corner, the e-motor kicks on and it pulls you out. So they're trying to best of both worlds. All-wheel drive corner exit with the freeness of a rear-wheel drive corner entry. The general tuning philosophy of the suspension is, this is more of a GT supercar, think 911 Turbo S or another big GT car. Last thing I'm going to talk about is the e-motor philosophy. The NSX has the ability to run continuous laps, so theoretically without totally discharging the battery. Because in that car's case, those e-motors are more for suspension stability and a little bit of corner exit capability. This has a real propulsion device. So if you drive this in hero mode, which is what they call their hot lap mode, you're supposed to drive it if you're trying to set a quali lap, you can fully discharge the battery to the point where the all-wheel drive will turn off. In my case, it took 3 laps around Autobahn, 2.5 at full pace.
And the reason they did that, according to Keith, was because they knew that certain clientele wanted to take it to the track and they wanted to prioritize the fastest lap and they wanted to give you the flexibility of just derating that battery. Like if you're on a straight right before the finish line, they didn't want to pull it away.
Yes.
They will sacrifice that front axle, that front end power to give you all of that.
Yeah, and as soon as you get back on the braking, obviously you'll start to recharge the battery. In lucky case for the E-Ray, for our laps, it will do one lap and 4 turns around south before it fully decharges the battery. So you have that 160 horsepower the entire time. And that's sort of the fine print of this. If you put this in Charge Plus, which doesn't give you full power all the time, it will make sure there's still battery power left in it, which is really the way this car is supposed to be driven. If you're going to do extended lapping, it'll never fully discharge the front motor, but you'll never get full power all the time.
And you notice it.
Yes.
It's definitely noticeable.
It's like when our driver, Britt, ran the laps, I think he said it was like a second to maybe 2 seconds a lap slower, fully discharged, versus having e-motor left over or e-power left over. The other thing versus the NSX is that this is not built around going back into e-mode. You can either put this in shuttle mode or stealth mode in the beginning, which will start up in pure EV, and the other mode will allow you to just drive around slowly. And when you're in full EV, and I think shuttle or whatever the...
Shuttle is the one where you can only go 15 miles an hour. It's a golf cart.
Stealth
and you actually have to turn it back off to restart it, where stealth allows you to get out of the driveway. It starts up an EV until it's depleted and starts the gasoline.
Or you go watt and it'll start back up. Yeah. The fine print of that is, unlike the NSX, you do not get air conditioning.
Right. Yeah, there's no electric AC compressor in the E-Ray versus the NSX, where it's more like a true hybrid experience, what we're used to.
The last thing I will talk about is there is some controversy on this online, is the brake-by-wire. And when Britt talks about it during his laps, or when we talk about it, these are much different approaches to how brake-by-wire works, but it is, or as GM calls it, e-boost. The feedback loop you get out of the brake pedal is digital. While there is a physical, let's call it hydraulic backup in the brake pedal, the actual feedback loop under ABS, under brake pressure as you're threshold braking, is a computer algorithm for feedback. It's not what the hydraulic fluid is doing in the master and in the individual pistons being pushed back through the pedal. But I will say it is very, very well calibrated in this car, particularly compared to the NSX. Acura NSX Type S, Mark, 350 of these things ever produced. And for a while, the NSX was the only American supercar when production started in 2017. This car is hand-built. I know you've talked about the manufacturing process, but I was actually there when they made the last ever NSX. They had a Boy Scout come out, he played taps, everyone was really sad, and that's the end of this car. So let's talk about some of the obvious stuff. This has unique aero treatments versus the regular NSX. The front and rear fascias are different. It has the diffuser off the GT3 car in the back. Most of this is about better cooling and, of course, more aero capability, less lift, more downforce. How much more lift or how much more downforce does this negate or produce? Don't know, but it's better.
Yeah, much like the suspension tuning changes, the chart just shows better. So we're just going to have to understand that what they did here was largely for performance improvements, efficiency improvements, And what else did they change, Jack?
So the MR dampers, as you talked about, are now better. They recalibrated them. They have a new IPU, new IPU software, which is the control software for the all-wheel drive system, which we'll talk about in a second. Better trans tuning. It is much, much faster in downshifting. They prioritized G-based or braking-based downshifting, so it's faster than it used to be. Honda, as Mark talked about, developed this gearbox in-house, and it is very, very capable. The 3.5-liter V6, yes, it's a V6. It has 2 turbochargers, and now produces 27 more horsepower than it used to. And that's through a mix of variables that they changed. So this now gets the turbochargers off of the GT3 race car, which means it produces 0.9 more PSI, which is not a lot, but they have also better cooled it through more efficient intercoolers and bigger injectors. All of this combined makes this total system output with the 3 e-motors to be 600 horsepower. This is a smaller physically car than the E-Ray. It also weighs slightly less, but it is slower in a straight line. The E-Ray does 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. Instrumented testing, the few outlets that got to, with the NSX Type S 2.9, the quarter mile is in the high 10s, where the E-Ray is in the mid 10s. However, this car does have some unique e-motor tuning. There are 3 in this car's case versus the single one that is in the E-Ray. You have 1 in each front axle and 1 in the trans, basically between the gearbox and the engine itself. Do you want to express how the system works?
So unlike the Corvette, they use the torque vectoring differential in the front, which is embodied of like their SH all-wheel drive. So that torque vectoring in the front allows them to do a lot of things in terms of tuning. At least for the Type S, what they wanted to do was make this car a little bit more neutral. To your explanation earlier, a lot of these changes were for performance and increasing the yaw of the rear. However, this car, from its inception, was always a little bit more pushy in the front end. It's designed to help pull you through the corner safely, and it's been kind of the argument of this generation of car. What was the tuning philosophy? And to me, it felt more street safe, more extremely safe at the limit. This is not a car that is ever going to oversteer on you, at least in any of our testing. It's also dynamically tuned around a much narrower tire than what comes on the E-Ray by default. You're talking about a massive difference.
245 front, 305 rear. It is a massive mechanical grip level difference in the 2 cars. And also you can't, unless you use shims, get the same alignment capability out of the NSX as you can the E-Ray. The E-Ray, you can get over 3 degrees of negative camber if you're brave. Right. This car, with shims, no one's really talked about it, but I can't imagine it's anywhere close to that.
Much like the Corvette, this was more of a GT street car first. Like Type S is not the track-focused car, it bridges the gap. So Honda will tell you consistently, we're not looking for outright lap times, we're looking to make a good drivable street car that's comfortable. And then for somebody that wants to go rip around on track, it can do some of that. So there's things that they left off the table here in order to achieve those goals. And a lot of that started with the concept of how they wanted this car to be in its era, and that was deliver hybridization. And when we say hybridization, unlike the Corvette, the hybridization here was not just purely for performance to give you straight line speed. It's about starting up the car with the engine and then basically getting you off in EV mode when you're in that quiet setting, which is more of your normal drive mode. As soon as you get out, you're in EV, and the car will maintain almost perfect hybridization by never depleting that battery. Even on track, you're never in a derated state. And that's the big difference here between the Corvette, is that power is always consistent, and the changes with the intercooler, the tuning, you're always making the advertised power, and you don't feel that timing getting pulled, you don't feel the loss of power from the e-motors. But again, you're driving around where this car is cutting in and out of the gasoline engine and going purely in EV at certain times, namely around town. And the benefit is there's a lot smoother transmission engagement when you're going in.
Reverse is all e-motor.
Yeah, reverse and going forward is all an e-motor, and it gives you that fill where you don't feel the jerkiness of the dual clutch transmission either. You don't have that first gear like lurching because you have the e-motors kind of getting you going before that transmission can be handed off. So even the trans tuning here is far more smooth. It is the closest thing that we've tested to a PDK. And when we talk about Honda automatic transmissions, I don't think that's like
it's
such
never a good thing.
Right,
Yeah.
It's such a wild statement, because what they've been able to do with the engine and the transmission here is absolutely on another level. And both of these products were designed, the engine and transmission were bespoke to this car. They've never reutilized anything for it. So when you look at this car, The NSX was a ground-up, one-off car for Honda, which is extraordinarily rare in any industry now. Even the Corvette, which we didn't really talk about, you said, you know, it's one of the most highly manufactured sports cars on the planet.
Yeah, in comparison, Bowling Green, where the Corvette's builds 200 a day, approximately, of all the various C8 trims. They built 350 of these total.
Right, and that regular NSX was lucky to sell 300 a year.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, put that in perspective. So this car is...
They never amortize their costs the way but that's also why this car was $200,000.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of the situation with this car is putting in perspective of when it came out, and Honda will tell you it's almost a generation and a half old
Two
now.
generations.
You know, yeah, you're talking about 2013. This was coming out where the LaFerrari development started. So the competitors at that time were wildly expensive. So what they were trying to do here was a lot for this brand because most of the development was in-house. They had a team that had never worked on brake-by-wire. It was first implementation. Talking about an e-motor hybrid system like this with torque vector in the front hadn't been done before. Yeah. Coming up with the controls, the software, the hardware to control those, we're in a different era, and a lot of the problems with this car come from the fact that it's lacking modern processing power to control these electromechanical systems like we rave about in Porsche products. Like, it's so well thought out. This hadn't been done yet for this brand, and it's really, when you say 2 generations old, it does feel that way.
This came out in the middle of the 2017 NSX, the first iteration of this car, came out in the middle of C7 sales, which is crazy.
It is crazy. So it's amazing what they were capable of doing, but it also shows the passage of time, the things that were not done well really stand out now compared to its modern competitors that have figured out the controls part of these cars.
To be fair to everybody who's like, that's not an excuse. It's not, because this came out in 2022.
Right, yeah.
And this car in 2022 was nearly $200,000.
And to be fair to the Type S and Honda, and to be fair to the viewers, this car was also updated to improve those controls for the Type S, processing speed and all that. And it's still, again, you can't defeat the fact that,
it's an old car underneath.
Yeah, exactly. So I think really we're going to go through track first, Jack, and talk about what this car feels like. And then we're going to set some lap times and where we can have a real discussion about the pros and cons of street versus track and a lot more technical information.
All right.
This car again after our original NSX video because we didn't focus too much on this car. We focused on the old one, and now here it is, a very rare car that's out of production now, and according to a lot of people, this might be the car that people remember from Honda and Acura of kind of like a great car from this generation. What do you think?
I think the story of development of this car and all the crap that Honda had to go through and Acura to get this thing to market is what makes this vehicle special. I will say, from a development perspective, what they accomplished when they did. This generation of NSX came out 2017, at least that was the first model year, but they were starting like development and really all their engineering in the early 2010s. And what this car represented was an affordable hybrid supercar, while the other variants of this from like Porsche and Ferrari were $1 million. But ignoring the historical part of this car, compared to what you get today, you can definitely see how much vehicles have progressed from a engineering proficiency perspective. I mean, walk me through what you're feeling behind the wheel.
Well, one thing I want you to do is just listen to this engine and gearbox for a minute, because that's really the best part of this car. Sound tube behind us that pumps in some induction noise that you lose with turbocharged cars. They have a dual clutch transmission that is right on the heels of a PDK, despite this being almost a generation old. They never reused it. Everything's bespoke about this car, which is, I'm going to be honest, that's what makes it feel special, but it's also its deficiencies. As we talked about in the shop, the things that they had to do to create this new technology that they hadn't worked on before, is also his Achilles heel.
The brake feel in this car is terrific.
It's like a Logitech pedal set. It's just very spring-loaded. You can't tell what the brakes are doing. Threshold braking is, you know, you're doing guesswork every time to see where the ABS actuation point is. When you're in that less 5/10 or 10/10, it's really hard to gauge your maximum braking force without it just kind of becoming a mess. And the front end, Jack, I think that's the biggest thing is, I know this is, you know, when you compare it to the E-Ray especially, this car wants to understeer a lot. Way more than I anticipated.
There's not really any way you can get the nose to come in under other than like big throttle lift. It has this constant understeer push, and it almost is worse with VSA all the way up. We're at VSA track, so you can feel the brakes working actually a little, what feels like in the front to get it to turn in. But you know, under a constant throttle like this, all the front end does is start to just wash out. I thought it would pull you through corners harder, but it does not. I will say though, it is ultra safe feeling. This is a car that you could have limited driving aptitude in and fly around this racetrack, and you would have to do something fairly terrifically stupid to loop this thing.
Yeah,
you're more likely to understeer out of a corner than you are to get the rear end totally upset.
100%. I think one thing that we really realized over the past 2 days of driving this hard is it's super sensitive to tire pressures. When those tire pressures get too high, this car turns into an absolute understeer fest. And now that they're kind of like down to nominal levels, like normal levels, it's way more engaging. The drive, the front end works a little bit more. I mean, it's not great. You can hear this kind of tires getting abused. It's also a byproduct of this being an old tire compound. And even though the tires are new, it's an old compound. It doesn't compete to the newer track day tires.
Particularly the bespoke Pilot 4S's that are on the...
And it's under tired compared to the competition now. Everybody's going to like 325s. This has still got a pretty narrow tire in the back.
And a narrow tire up front, which is one of the reasons you're also running this off so quick. Because it is, just like the E-Ray, a very, very heavy car. I want to touch back on the braking. The brake feel is poor. The actual performance of these carbon ceramics, there's a really high overhead with the thermal limits of this. You can put a lot of abuse into them, and they seem to hold up pretty well.
Yeah, Jag, it's kind of interesting. Like it's a mixed bag of all this, cutting edge technology that they threw in here. One of the things that I found that is consistent from the original car I drove is, while some of this stuff works, I feel, and I talked to Britt about this, you spend more time trying to figure out what the hell is going on with the systems versus just being connected to the car. There's a lot of like, do I lift here? Do I keep my foot matted? What's the front end gonna do? Where's the pedal force for braking? You're second guessing a lot of these systems that are there to try to make you faster, and it doesn't feel natural like the mechanical systems do. And I think it really boils down to the controls of this car in the era of which the microprocessor controls of all these electromechanical systems are not where they need to be in this current era of cars that's accelerated so quickly. So everything feels like there's a layer of delay and disconnect in terms of inputs. Like if I start sawing at the wheel, you can feel electric motors coming in, and then it's kind of reacting, and then you do something else and it's trying to fix that. It's just a weird car to drive, and it's not one that you easily get connected with, despite
at least that 10/10s on the track.
Yeah.
A lot of these problems disappear when you're on the street.
And listen, gearbox is tremendous, the engine's tremendous. I mean, this is a car that makes me sad in a way. I wish they would have continued developing this, because this is like, there's a lot of Honda here, but there's a lot of things that's also Honda, and the fact that they didn't just keep it going and making it better and better. So that's where I'm going to leave it, Jack.
All right, Mark, I think it's time for us to drive my kind of car. V8, Bowling Green Corvette. Mark, you hear that? That's the sound of V8. I don't want no V6 in my $100,000 mid-engine sports car. I want me some V8. I want some Bowling Green, powered by Mary Para exclusively. Yeah.
I hear synthesizer. Does that mean that it's a spaceship?
Yes, Mark. I will say, in comparison, this car feels like a spaceship in speed over the NSX. Let's get this out of the way right away. How Keith's team and Sarab and all the other Corvette engineers we've talked to figured out how to marry the front axle to the back axle in this car is leaps and bounds superior. And now we're out of charge plus mode, full speed in the braking zone. It feels so much better on turn in. There's more power, there's better brake calibration than the NSX. I mean, this is just a far superior driving car. And within 2 seconds behind the wheel of this car, you don't fight the rear. The actual car wants to rotate under throttle, under lift. The front end works well. I mean, such a very, very impressive driving car on track for somebody that's supposed to be a GT. And the skill level required to put this thing around is, you know, not that high, to be honest. It's surprisingly easy to drive even with all these cameras in the car blocking my vision. I mean, what are your thoughts? You are not a Corvette man like me. You're not the king of Bowling Green.
I think what they managed to do here that's really surprised me is they took a formula that worked and they used the technology not as an experiment, not as a gimmick to interfere with the V8 driving experience. It's there to improve upon it, where it disappears into the background and makes the driving experience more emotional and better. And when I say better, you already talked about it. It didn't alter the driving dynamics. It still feels like a rear-wheel drive car. When you turn the wheel, it's not pulling at you or changing the direction of the car. It just turns in like a V8 rear-wheel drive.
Yeah, see, I'm on throttle, the back end's moving around, the front's pulling you through, hard on brakes. Front end comes in remarkably well on throttle, the back end's coming around. Brake, bring it in. Front end turns in, unlike the NSX. Power out, front pulls you through, back pulls you through.
You don't run the front off in this car despite, you know, like, you could argue the tire choice in this car, but you have wider tires, which helps with mechanical grip. The brakes feel more natural. The car really does feel like it's super well balanced. You don't feel like you're fighting it, and you don't feel like you're fighting the electronics and the electric part of this car. And it's a car that, you know, the NSX might be that car that you look at and like you might want or lust after.
Yeah.
It looks and kind of feels that special because there's not a lot of them. But this is the car you actually want to drive. It truly is a car that rewards somebody that doesn't have a lot of driving skill, and it also is rewarding for somebody that really loves to drive, and that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I would say the only two negatives of this car versus the NSX is that you have to drive around hero mode.
Yeah.
So if you take this out of Charge Plus, you can discharge the battery. So you have to think about when you're utilizing all 650 horsepower, and away with the NSX, you just mat it and it goes and it never pulls e-power. And the other con, if it is a con, is I would argue the gearbox calibration in the NSX may not be objectively better, but subjectively, when you're using the paddles, it feels really, really sharp, where some of our complaints with this Tremec still exists in the same way we complained about it in the Z06 and in the traditional C51, though the e-motor in this car does actively pull you through shifts. So there's no disconnect between right pedal and acceleration.
The gearbox isn't as sharp in manual mode. It doesn't take commands as well as like the PDK. I mean, the Acura transmission or the Honda transmission is superior in terms of its performance and consistency of performance. The brake, the brake-by-wire system in here, of course, we said the same thing about the Z06 at the absolute limit. It gets vague. You don't really know.
But at least it's consistent on the NSX.
It's way more consistent than the generation of brake system in the NSX for certain.
So Mark, other than wanting to hear this in the next big straight, is there anything else you want to talk about before we head to the next section of our very long video?
No, let me hear it rip.
V8. So we've learned a lot, but now it's time to talk about what these cars are like at their dynamic limit, including their lap times. We spent 2 days on track at Autobahn Country Club with both of these vehicles. Please introduce yourself, sir.
Hi guys, I'm Britt Casey, 2018 IMSA TCR champion. Used to race in IMSA, and I'm also one of the instructors over at Autobahn Country Club in Joliet, Illinois. Let's take a look at my lap with the NSX Type S. Well, the lap time, Jack, was a 132.88. For the Acura NSX Type S, I could say, in general, the theme is it's a generation behind what the Corvette is now producing. I think the takeaway for me, too much understeer in general for the track.
So I guess let's walk through that understeer problem. Traditionally, I mean, both of these cars are all-wheel drive. What does all-wheel drive do to the dynamic balance of a car at the limit?
So it generally will hurt your ability to turn mid-corner, especially when you get onto the throttle again. If the front wheels are being driven by the driveline or electric motors in this case, there is more weight up front right there. And then also, trying to get on the power mid-corner, you lose rotation from the front steering tires.
When you mean weight, you mean weight balance. As you put power into the front of the vehicle, it shifts the weight forward and basically introduces an understeer moment, correct?
Correct. And also the packaging of the driveline motors or motor in the front would add weight to the front nose, whereas it would be more balanced without all-wheel drive.
Perfect. And in the NSX, did you feel that when you were mid-corner, despite its torque vectoring, as you added throttle, just pushed the car out wide, correct?
For sure. Probably one of the most apparent problems I've seen in any of the cars we've driven. As soon as I get on the gas, well, even before then, the car was understeering on entry off all the pedals, but as soon as you get on the gas pedal, it's like an on-off switch with the front grip. Like it just goes all away, and big time understeer to the exit.
And this was something we were fighting on our own end. We adjusted tire pressures throughout the day. We started a little higher and we started to bleed them off. Basically, as we bled off the pressures, the car turned a little better. But honestly, I think given the test scenario, you ran the fastest lap time possible. And again, given how rubbered in the track was, this was best case scenario for the NSX Type S. Before we get into the brakes, I also want to talk about sort of the inconsistent feeling of the car. That's something Mark and I both felt, and I know you talked about it as well. The car always seemed to be doing different things.
I think a lot of the sensation was actually coming from the wheel as well. Yes, we could talk about the brakes, but in terms of steering sensations, the ability for the car to even turn in was inconsistent. I felt like I was turning in at the same point, but the car would turn in less than I was requesting sometimes, it seemed like.
And then sometimes mid-corner, the motors would kick in and kick off, and it would do weird things to the dynamics of the vehicle.
And right? I think all that did was just elevate tire temps, and it just made the car drive worse, and it got more slick out there. Crazy. So
one of the things you said to me earlier, which I really appreciate, is you said that the most consistent thing about the NSX was its inconsistency.
Which is okay. I mean, it's an older car, but I think comparatively, it's got big deficits to the Corvette.
Braking is the last part I want to talk about. Both of these systems are brake-by-wire, both in the E-Ray and the NSX. Yes, GM calls it E-Boost, but the brake pedal is effectively a load cell in both of these cars, which means what's happening in the actual calipers and tires are not what's being translated in the pedal. It's an assumption, a mathematical model in both of these cars to generate brake feel. That said, they do feel dramatically different. How does it feel in the NSX?
Well, in the NSX, I had a really rare moment, which it has ABS, stability control and everything, but I got a right rear lockup going into turn 11, which is a super heavy brake zone at the end of the back straight. So probably slowing down close to 100 miles an hour there, from like 130 down to almost 30 miles an hour. So either the car was pitching itself forward and lifting up the rear tire to a point where it was locking up the right rear tire, which is the inside tire there, or it just, I don't really know, it wasn't mapped out right, but that's pretty rare to get a lock up. And
to be clear, both of these vehicles were run in their track stability mode. The E-Ray was run in PTM Race 2, which is the fastest mode according to the Corvette engineers. And the NSX, you ran it both ways, actually drove better with the stability in track mode.
And I would like to add, it wasn't like I locked up a tire and threw it off the track. It was mostly just I missed the apex and I just had to gather it up. So
now we've talked a lot about the negative sides of the NSX. There is one very positive thing about it, and it is the drivetrain, correct?
The gearbox mapping on the upshift side and the downshift side, I thought it was awesome. Really on the downshift side, so in a brake zone, the downshifts get done really fast, but they're also really well balanced. Like the blipping in the mapping is really slick, and the upshifts there's like no shock to the driveline at all. You don't lose drive, so it's really smooth.
Yeah, the engine tuning and the trans tuning of the NSX really are genuinely world class.
I liked it a lot.
So let's talk about the Corvette E-Ray. First off, let's show your lap. lap time wise, the E-Ray was a hell of a lot faster than the NSX Type S. There's no way to sugarcoat it. It's nearly 5 seconds lap quicker. It ran essentially a 128 flat. Again, best case scenario, it was not so cold the tires didn't work, but there was a lot of rubber on the track. This was the best way you could possibly lap the E-Ray. The E-Ray was on its stickier rubber and it was in its track alignment. Walk me through how this car drove.
Well, I thought the E-Ray kind of excelled over the NSX in every category. I felt like it's just a newer car, you know, faster computers inside of it, thinking and doing more adjustments more quickly. It's just a really cool car. I told Keith when I got out of it that I've never driven a car that uses the all-wheel drive system as a complement to it on track rather than a liability. And I think that is just such a new thing for me, experiencing an all-wheel drive system, which is a hybrid and it's a heavier car, but it drives well on the racetrack. The way it deploys energy on corner exit, it modulates power. It's not just like gonna blast, you know, all the energy into the front tires. It can adjust itself. So like turn 7, the kink, it's a flat out right-hander. The hybrid system would deploy energy before the turn in, and then it would sort of bleed off. And then add it back after the corner, which is just so, it's just really intuitive, really well thought out. And the car felt really at home on track.
Yeah, it allows you, the way the control systems work, and the engineers will tell you this as well, they want it to rotate in like a rear-wheel drive car using the advantages of rear-wheel drive architecture. Then as you've basically exceeded that yaw moment and you need to straighten out the car, then the motor kicks in.
It'll balance back to a neutral state. It was awesome.
Let's talk about the braking as well. Obviously, again, brake by wire. And I know when we talked about this many moons ago in the Z06 versus GT3 video, it was a little bit of a deficit in that car. But how did you feel it compared to the NSX in this variant?
Sure. Obviously, hydraulic over everything for me. In terms of feel and feedback that you get as a driver, it's you can't get better with a brake by wire system. But between the two, the Acura NSX and the Corvette E-Ray, I would say the brake-by-wire system in the E-Ray is a step up for sure.
If you look at the lap times and you look at the data, and Mark will overlay it, essentially, there's no real way to say this, but the E-Ray is faster everywhere versus the NSX. Corner entry, corner exit, mid-corner. I mean, it is just a clearly more capable car. And I know we say this all the time, lap times are not everything, you don't drive a lap time, but say you change some of the parameters of this test. You gave the NSX a ridiculous race car alignment. You put it on wider, stickier, wheels and tires. I don't think it would make up that 5-second deficit. It's just a generation behind in technology. As we're going to talk about in the final thoughts, these are clearly two very, very different cars.
It goes without saying there's a generation gap between these two cars, and it makes sense that the E-Ray has bested the NSX in every single performance metric. It's also a more emotional car to drive, and you could argue it's more usable. It has a frunk, a trunk, and you can take the roof off of the car. So there is a big shift also in technology. The E-Ray has done a lot of what the NSX set out to do for $50,000 plus less than what the NSX started at. However, there are some things that the NSX was able to do that still hold up today, and that in many cases I prefer to drive it on the street. And a lot of that has to do with the interior space. It's a little bit more traditional, and its hybrid system works amazing. It's more of like what we're used to in economy hybrids today. The engine can turn off and you can roll around where you're not getting fatigued by some of the drone of the sport exhaust. You can roll into your driveway in quiet. You don't have to turn the car off to go into hybrid mode. There's so much thought to design there, is making it a usable everyday supercar. And in that case, it's better than the Corvette. It also has some distinct advantages in terms of drivetrain. The dual clutch is far sharper. It feels more reactive. It feels more like a PDK. And the V6 is incredible. Even to today's standards, the output of this car is consistent. It feels alive. It always makes you want to wring it out. And it's also doing all this with 2 less cylinders than the Corvette. So again, it depends on what you're looking for. Clearly, the Type S is out of production and it's insanely expensive to buy on the used market now. If you're a collector, clearly you're gonna love to have it because it it looks great and there's not a lot of them. But if you're just looking for that mid-engine supercar experience, it's really hard to beat the E-Ray in what it's attempting to do for its price point. And while the fairy tale continues for Corvette owners as they spin up multiple different trim levels for the C8 generation, if you're a Honda loyalist, it's a bit more difficult. And I think I have a better appreciation after driving this car and talking to the engineers how much they were able to accomplish in that short time frame that they had to make that car. The NSX serves as a reminder of what you can do when you push the boundaries of innovation. The Corvette proves what can be done when you stick to a formula and keep improving it, figuring out large-scale production and manufacturing to help drive down costs for enthusiasts. Regardless, both of these cars have shown us that there is a future in electrifying the internal combustion engine, and dare I say it, in many cases make it better. Last but not least, a big thank you to all that were involved in creating this video. Autobahn Country Club for giving us a home to do some of these comparison tests that allow us to test the dynamic limits of these cars without trying to do something crazy on the street. They are a great place to learn how to drive, run track days, or do their driving academy, so hit them up. Also a big thank you to Bridgestone Tire, who's been supplying us with many tires for some of our tests. Also, thanks to Corvette and Acura, who wanted to do this video to showcase what was possible with some of the innovation and electrifying the internal combustion engine. Corvette brought out one of their engineers and he helped us set out the car and learn and help Britt to understand the nuances of it. We also had the help from Jonathon Rivers and Andrew and Jake over at Acura and Lynn from Honda that really supported this project, along with our original NSX project that took us to Japan to learn about how that car was made and the history of it. And now this all culminated into this video. And it's one of those when you have everybody working together for the same purpose, to help others learn, to have a better appreciation for the technology behind these cars. It's one of the reasons why I'm still doing this, and thank you to the viewers who continue to watch this.